Good morning, everyone. It is wonderful to see everyone. Just in case we haven't met yet, my name's Carter Bradley. I'm Verus Insight's co-founder and CEO. On behalf of my co-founder, John, and me, John is just back here. On behalf of our whole team here in DC and everyone across the country, a very, very warm welcome to now our 8th University Recruiting Annual Members Meeting. So we can get started with all of our substance in just a moment, but I did want to take stock very quickly right off the bat of who is in the room. So if this is your first time at a UR annual members meeting, could you raise your hand? Oh, wow. Well, welcome. Okay, I'm gonna batch the next few. So how about if this is your second or your third UR annual members meeting? Oh boy, there we go. That is a good number. Less applause than first. Okay, that's fine. We'll get back to high applause once we get to the end. So what about fourth or fifth? Okay, there we go. Okay, so there's a key detail I should have said, which is that virtual meetings count. And also, part of the reason I asked this is because the first 4 years of running this meeting, we didn't track very closely who was here. So most of my sense of who was here is actually from the pictures that we had from those years, which is why I asked. But what about sixth or seventh? Okay. My guess, actually, as to who had been here 8 times had been Don John, who has been a partner and advisor since I think before I had products. But what about 8? Maura Quinn? Maura Quinn. Huh? I think it's all of them as well. You were actually my other guess. Yeah. So last year, Maura was my one guess as to who had been there for 7 years, and I called her out by name only to find out that she was running 10 minutes late. And but anyways, I think, so 8 years ago in 2017, we ran our first ever University Recruiting Annual Members Meeting in a half-carpeted, half-furnished space in the Watergate building about a mile that way. And we had 25 attendees at that meeting. 10 of those attendees, we're delighted to get 25, but 10 of those attendees were from one organization. That is the only year that we encouraged that, and in that specific year, we were delighted to have 10 people from that one company. But this year, we have just about 220 folks in attendance. So if this is your 2nd through 8th year at the members meeting, it is wonderful to see you. Welcome back. And if this is your first year, I honestly cannot tell you how thrilled I am that you're here for this meeting and that you're part of this broader community. So a very, very warm welcome again. So, oh, we can do an applause for that. That's, yeah. So as you'll see in just a moment, this meeting is all about content and collaboration. So it's sharing the largest, most consequential findings that we've had from all of our research throughout the year and combining it with creating a venue for connection and collaboration with everyone else in this room, with the other leaders in this space who represent some of the most senior university recruiting leaders in the country. But there's also a third kind of more meta purpose to this meeting as well. You all tell us pretty consistently that throughout the year, it can be difficult to take a step back, to lean back, think big, think about the largest, most consequential, most existential issues that you all are working on. So in addition to content, in addition to collaboration, the third purpose you could think of for this meeting is to create that intellectual venue, to create the space for you all to be able to take a step back and grapple with the largest issues that matter for your organization next year and the issues that matter for our industry next year. Now, in just a moment, I'm going to set up our agenda, and then we can get started with our keynote. But I did want to do just a moment of framing on that core issue that we are seeing right now, way up at the front of the meeting, partially because this is going to be the main content theme of our next 48 hours together. And that theme is efficiency. How members are finding cost savings, how they're restructuring their teams, and the consequences of those actions for the university recruiting industry as a whole, and for all of your programs. Now, this core theme, efficiency and cost cutting, it's not going to be the exclusive topic of conversation or topic of content across the next 48 hours, but it's going to be a very significant pillar. My keynote that I'll get started on in just a moment is going to outline some of the top findings that we've had from a pretty sweeping 6-month investigation into how members are finding efficiencies, how members are finding costs that they might be able to do without, how they're restructuring their teams, and of course the consequences of all of those restructurings on their programs. But also our member panel tomorrow is going to focus on cost cuttings and efficiencies within university recruiting, and many of the breakout sessions that you all have been placed in will focus on that topic, that core topic as well. Now, many of you have been in the university recruiting industry in this space far longer than I have. I was reminded of that, actually, this morning by someone. But, you know, a lot of you know this. It's been 9 years for me at this point. So 9 years in which studying the work that you all do has been the core focus of my work and the core focus of our firm's work. And I can tell you with confidence that in those 9 years of working in this space, I have not seen a movement for efficiency as deep and as widespread as the one that we're seeing right now. So as with any moment where there's a big issue facing members, our first order priority is practical support for all of you. And we've got a lot of that across the next 24 hours and tomorrow as well. So even today, we're going to present some dozens of ideas that you might be able to implement for how other members have found cost savings, have found efficiencies, and deep analysis that we ran, of course, on the consequences that those movements and those initiatives had for their programs, had for their organizations as a whole. But I also wanted to frame up right from the start that, at least for us, there is a larger issue, a larger question that we've been thinking about as well, which is namely, is this movement for efficiencies, for cost savings, is this a momentary blip? Is this just a reaction to the overhiring and overspending of the 2021-2022 period? Or is it possible that there's something larger going on? Is it possible that what we're really seeing right now is the beginnings of a shift in the balance of priorities for university recruiting from what you could think of as promise to returns? Is it possible that we're at the threshold of a few years within the UR space that are going to look a little bit different than what they've looked like for the last few years? Now, I don't know the answer to that, of course. I can't know the answer to that definitively. No one can. But I can tell you that after studying this question for the last 6 months and interviewing a lot of you on what you're doing and why, my prediction is that yes, that what we're seeing right now, this movement for efficiencies, is indicative of something larger that might have some staying power in the space. So our keynote in just a moment, in the keynote, I'm going to present all of the evidence that we've collected as to that prediction and outline a bit of what you might be able to do in response to that. But regardless of the answer to that question, regardless of whether that is a definitive yes or a definitive no or somewhere in between, it still feels like the central big question that a lot of you are grappling with right now. So as a result, it is a key feature, a key pillar of our meeting for the next couple days. I hope you find today and tomorrow valuable, both to set your strategy for next year, but also to create a network that you can lean on throughout the year and for the years to come. But as a final note, before we get started with our substance, I also just wanted to note that I hope you know how grateful we all are at Veris to be able to get to do this work with you. It's just a total privilege for us to get to serve you throughout the year, but it is a particular privilege for us to get to host you here today and tomorrow. So from all of us, another just very big thank you to all of you. Let's get started with our keynote. So to get started, let's just do a very quick run through our agenda so that you have a sense of what we have coming over the next day or so. So right now, we are in our keynote that we've called the Great Reset, in which I'm going to be outlining some of the largest findings that we've had from a 6-month initiative where we've been studying how members have been finding efficiencies, cost savings, et cetera. We're then going to have 45 minutes for lunch and networking, and then move into our first concurrent breakout session. So there are 2 types of breakouts that you have been placed in. One, focused on the topics that you told us would be most interesting. Those are topic strategy labs. And second are dedicated executive forums. Now, many of you will be familiar with the dedicated executive forum formula that we've developed over the last year, but this is a new innovation. So the idea with this is that we heard from all of you that there is always value in conversation with other heads of UR, but there is particular value when it is a curated group. So it's a group either curated to the industry that you work in, curated to the size of program that you run, or in some cases, curated to both. So across the last year, we've been beginning to build dedicated executive forums, which can serve, in some cases, as a little bit of a home base for you within the broader membership. And this will be the first opportunity for those dedicated executive forums to meet in person. So you'll notice that you all have been placed at, you all have labels at your tables with your dedicated executive forum grouping, but also it should be on your name tag as well. So we'll have those breakouts that will be topics specific to your industry in those concurrent breakouts as well. At 4 p.m., I have a fireside chat up here with Eric Gertler, who is the executive chairman and CEO of the U.S. News and World Report. Eric is fascinating to listen to on anything, but he is particularly interesting on a number of topics that we all work on significantly. So education, the role of education in the U.S. economy. He does a lot and thinks a lot about the role of public-private partnerships, corporations with universities. He does a decent amount on student priorities. So we're going to hit on all of those topics, as well as, of course, some questions about the rankings that U.S. News puts out, which I know is going to be the big question everyone's interested to ask him. Then at 5 p.m., we have our social activities, our evening reception and dinner at the Hamilton Live. I will not name names, but I have heard half-jokingly a couple members note to me that despite the hundreds of hours that we put into all of the substance, which they're massively grateful for, the real meeting starts at 5. Then tomorrow, Tomorrow, we have breakfast and member connections at 9 a.m. A quick flag here we have a member connection booth. You all have been paired with someone, and the idea for tomorrow's breakfast is that you might have a connection breakfast. So at some point today, go by that booth so that you can get your pairing. Then we'll have a presentation on winning top talent. At 11 a.m., our member panel, and then lunch, and finally, our final presentation, of course, with the wonderful Dr. Chelsea Shine on top trends for 2025. A few logistical notes. First, in your folder, you'll find a half sheet that orients you to all the spaces we're going to be using. We're in the main session room right now. Most sessions will be recorded, including this one. We'll send those out. If you have any questions, Various Insights team members have dark blue badges or dark blue ribbons on our badges. Come find us. But also, you're more than welcome to go find Nicole and Corey. Most of you know Nicole at this point, but they are the wonderful, phenomenal events team behind all of this. Their information is on this screen as well. Now, I couldn't get started with our content without doing a final thank you to our panelists for today and tomorrow. So Eric, I will introduce later today when he gets here. But Scott, Maura, and Carly are running our panel tomorrow. To the three of you, a really big thank you. I'm very excited for your session. So let's get started with our keynote. So we called this talk the Great Reset because it is our view that we are seeing a larger reset right now to members' university recruiting efforts than we have seen in our careers in this space. And the subject matter for this talk is among the most consequential that we've delivered. We're going to be talking about restructurings. We're going to be talking about cuts that members have needed to make, about a lot of initiatives that have either been imposed on university recruiting programs or that heads of UR have imposed on their programs themselves. But even if the content is some of the most consequential we've done, the structure for this talk is actually among the simplest that we've ever delivered. So we're going to do 3 sections, very straightforward. First, I'll outline this broader Great Reset movement that we are seeing and the larger initiative that we've run across the last 6 months to study how members are finding cost savings and efficiencies. Second, we'll outline some of the practices that we uncovered in the research that seem most worth sharing. In particular, we're going to outline 8 practices that feel worth putting up on the screen. In part 3, we'll do a very quick section outlining our top 5 conclusions from all of this research. Now, I'd like to do one final note before I jump into some of the answers and some of the content, which is basically amounts to a quick acknowledgement. Our job is to serve you, and that means studying the largest issues that you all are working on to the best of our ability at any given moment. Right now, that top issue is efficiency and deals with costs. But I also wanted to recognize up front that I know that subject matter can actually be very sensitive. We're going to be talking about cost-cutting initiatives, about team layoffs. We're going to be talking about the unwinding of some programs that leaders in this room have spent years and years developing, and a lot of other situations that for some have been stressful or actually just sad. So as with any of the other work we do, we approached this process with as much academic rigor as we possibly could. I'm going to present all of the findings across the next 50 or so minutes in kind with that. But I also wanted to acknowledge up front just how difficult I know this year has been for a lot of you, and how difficult it might be if you see some of these findings and you decide, actually, I might need to implement some of the larger restructures that I'm seeing here. Our hope with all of the work that we do is that we're able to provide you guidance, support, structure, insights into what others are trying, regardless of the type of outcome it is. When it's an exciting opportunity, we do that. Whenever it's an opportunity or an issue that is larger like this one, we'll do that as well. But I didn't want to get started with some of the substance without first just acknowledging that up front. So let's get started with part one. So let me first tell you about this initiative that we've launched, which has basically amounted to studying what we're seeing as the decades-defining movement for cost savings within university recruiting. And the spark for this initiative came about 6 months ago when we started to connect the dots between disparate notes that members were making, and we realized that they were adding up in sum to a pretty definitive shift in the tenor of university recruiting. It was pretty clear as soon as we actually started looking for it. Members were talking about major layoffs, going from 18 people on a team to 7, reducing their teams by 50%, even some members noting that they had been laid off along with large swaths of their team. Many others were flagging decreased demand and rec volume, noting that they had major downsizes to the forecasting side of things, that they were facing headwinds after a big merger, there were major changes in their world. Still others were just flagging restructurings of unprecedented scale, noting that it was creating sleepless nights, and in some cases, a couple members told us that in their 20, 30 years at a company, they'd never seen restructurings of the scale that they were seeing right now. These were some of the things that we heard from members, but really the list just went on and on. So, with the trend line clear, we decided to take a look behind the curtain, and what we found was what we ended up thinking of as a bit of an epidemic of contraction. So over the course of a couple days, what we did was we went through and scoured all of the notes that we could find from calls with you all. We looked through the inquiries and the questions that you all send in to us. We read the news and basically surveyed any other source that we could find to get a sense of how widespread these contraction-oriented movements were. And within a day, so within 24 hours, we found over 100 incidences of members imposing significant change on their programs. So let me give you a little bit of perspective on that. There are 260 organizations in the university recruiting membership right now. We found major incidences, significant changes in over a third of member organizations just at a cursory glance. So remember, that was exclusively what you all had already told us. We hadn't gone looking for it. Since we've started working on this, I've had many more members come out and say, actually, we are working on very similar things. And I would bet that if we went member by member and surveyed you all on whether you're working on similar things, we'd find very few who weren't doing something down this path. Another piece of context, we've already found some tens of millions of dollars that members have cut out of their budgets, and we know about millions more that members are planning to. And finally, this proved true across every single industry and every size of member organization. We had members who were recruiting 50 interns who were working to find creative ways to cut 30% of their costs. We had members recruiting 10,000 who were working on massive restructures of their overall strategy to go from outbound strategies to inbound strategies just to make sure that they could save on some of those outbound strategies. Basically, contraction just seemed like it was the name of the game in 2024 overall. So of course, we kept digging. And from those 100 incidences that we studied, we identified 77 unique actions that members use to pursue efficiencies and cost savings. And these range from cutting one school to save the couple $100s of T&E or the career fair sponsorships, all the way to restructures of teams, to outsource a lot of the jobs on the university recruiting team to lower cost geographies. These ranged the gamut. These 77 generally fell into 4 categories. There were changes to early careers demand, early careers programming, early careers team, and recruiting strategy. Now, you won't be able to read this slide, and I'm not expecting you to be able to go through. You might actually be able to read it, but I'm not expecting you to be able to read and dissect the detail here. More with this, I'm just giving you a sense of the steps in the research process that we went through. If you're interested, of course, I mean, all this work's at your disposal, so we're happy to send out the comprehensive list. But let's do one more lens of analysis before lifting up to some of the larger research questions that we tackled. From those 77, we started to synthesize them to try to get a sense of what categories or sources of savings were members finding savings from. So there were 15 main sources that we surfaced after doing this analysis. So within early careers demand, members found savings through program and demand contraction, basically just reducing the number of spots that they were going after. Hiring pauses and delays. We actually saw some consulting firms delay their start dates by over a year just to save costs on the salaries that year. And also program focus and narrowing. I'm going to talk about this a decent amount once we get to some of our case studies. This was a major category of tactic members tried where they limited the types of roles they were willing to go after to exclusively the highest return so that they could still deliver an A+ experience. Within early careers programming, members found savings through full program eliminations, just in the most extreme cases, but also intern program interventions, basically think like chipping away at costs associated with the internship, and also ancillary program interventions, think DEI programs or early ID programs or conferences, et cetera. Within early careers teams, some members did have simple team contractions, but also we saw a lot of team restructurings and efficiencies like flattening hierarchies, reducing specialization. That's another big category that we're going to come
to, et cetera. Work outsourcing, either through RPOs or through outsourcing to lower cost geographies. And then finally, geographic consolidation into regional hubs, which was generally just for some of the larger, more global practices.
And finally, within recruiting itself, members found savings through limiting sources to only those that produce the highest returns, prioritizing and eliminating schools. This was the single most common intervention across members, and I'll talk about that a lot more as we keep going. On-campus recruiting efficiencies, think like just reducing the number of events that you go to per campus, virtualization of different aspects of the recruiting process, and reduction of vendor partnerships. The way we thought about this, the way you could think about this list of 15 is kind of as a categorical menu. If you're going to find cost savings, very likely it is going to be from one of these 15 sources. It's kind of meant to be mutually exclusive and collectively exhaustive. And this was interesting. We found creating this framework really helpful for us analytically. It might be helpful for you analytically as well. But of course, the more interesting thing is how members actually operationalized a lot of these tactics, how they took some of these sources and then implemented strategies that actually helped them hit their end goals or the end goals of the business. That's going to be the topic, the subject of part 2 of this talk, is outlining how 8 members achieved the goals they had for cost savings and for efficiencies with some of these sources of savings. But I did want to just present the framework up front in case you found it helpful in terms of grounding. But let's just do 2 more quick notes on this research process before we get to some of those learnings. First note is on why. So we're seeing one of the largest movements for efficiency that we've seen, actually the largest that we've seen in our careers in this space. Why? What's driving this? Well, with every member that we interviewed, we went deep to try to get a sense of what was driving it, like, step back, step back, step back, step back. What is it that sparked this in the first place? And it turned out there were 4 main categories of drivers that we saw. The first just being simple cost-cutting mandates from the business. Some heads of UR basically just received blanket mandates saying they needed to cut costs. Sometimes this was specific to individual categories. That was something that we found a little bit odd, saying we need to see X% reduction in your team or we need to see X% reduction in your schools. Some got leeway to figure out how to do it themselves. So we need to see 10% reduction overall, and then they could figure it out. A couple other notes on these. We heard a lot of this was triggered by M&A or other similar business change. Often, most of the time, this was business-wide. This isn't just specific to UR or TA. And then finally, these range from minor budget cuts to 90% cuts in the research that we ran. Second, there was a category of members for whom demand lowered, and then they had the natural consequence or the natural next mandate, which is to resize programs to that smaller level of demand. This was most of the time viewed as a hangover, kind of a hangover effect from the 2021-2022 hiring period. Sometimes it was gradual, sometimes it was very, very sharp. A third category was more predictive. So some members got no mandates internally, but they just saw the writing on the wall. They had new leadership, or their leadership was asking questions, or they just kind of looked around at their industry and said, I feel like I might be getting some questions very soon. So they decided to take preemptive action and find some efficiencies, find some cost savings. Now, what I'll note is that kind of paradoxically, this approach often allowed university recruiting leaders to be more in the driver's seat when those mandates and those questions started to come. There are some topics about getting in the room for these conversations, some notes about that I'm going to make in the final section on top conclusions. But our final driver, some members just saw what was going on across the board. They were growing. They didn't think that they were going to get any mandates, but they looked around and said, you know what, there are probably some ideas for how I can do more with less, how I can streamline. Why don't I just ride this market and do a little bit of ROI housekeeping? That was a minority, but still like dozen plus members that we found who found themselves in that category. But regardless of the reason, what became clear to us as we were doing this research was that it felt like we were seeing a large reset, a great reset in the university recruiting industry from an era that we started to think of as an era of quote-unquote possibility of the 2010s, early 2020s, to an era that might be more defined by returns. We were seeing changes to the way university recruiting programs were viewed by the organization, from long-term investments in future leaders to shorter-term productivity plays. We were seeing changes to the investment criteria deployed by organizations, from holistic program quality and richness to hard expenditure ROI. And we were even seeing some changes to the criteria members were using to evaluate their talent, from talent potential to talent performance in the short term. Now, I want to note and make really clear that these axes are much more a scale than a flip. There were almost no members that we talked to who one day were on the left-hand side of this slide and then the next day were on the right-hand side of this slide. No, this was gradual, but after studying this for the last 6 months, after studying what hundreds of members are doing in this space, we came out of this convinced that the general tilt of the industry is towards a more returns-focused operation right now. It's just towards the right-hand side. So our mission, as ever, is to serve you in all of your hardest work and whatever those issues are. That's what we go out and study. So it is possible that this movement, this contraction-oriented movement, is unique to 2024, that we get to 2025 and all of a sudden it more resembles 2018, 2019 to what we've seen for the last 12 months. And if so, then we'll pivot our work and accordingly to whatever it is you all are working on next. But at least right now, this seems like the core issue. So to serve you in that work over the last 6 months, we launched what I noted as a pretty sweeping initiative to study member efforts, trying to focus on answering the central question that we see playing out in the market right now, which is how can members find savings while hopefully still preserving or even enhancing their competitiveness in the market? So to study that question, we started with pretty extensive member research. So we interviewed we studied the actions of over 100 members, conducted 25 very deep, in-depth interviews with members, studied thousands of data points that we collected from other sources. And from that, the first output that we created is what we called our practice repository of 33 ideas for how members found cost savings and efficiencies and analysis of those initiatives from all of our research. The booklet that you all have in front of you outlines those 33 ideas from members. I will note that a couple things about this. The first is that all of these practices have been thoroughly anonymized in terms of generalizing the industry, the program size, et cetera. And also, we've even changed the numbers within all of these so that they still get across the main point, but they're still not identifiable. We're going to highlight 8 of the tactics from this booklet in the keynote, in part 2 of our keynote in just a moment. But of course, this is something that we'd be delighted to talk through much more in depth in follow-up. Our final output from phase 1 of this research is today's keynote, where of course we have our 2 sections to come. One on the top practices and ideas that we found from this research, basically highlights from that booklet you have in front of you. And then second on the top 5 takeaways that we had from running all of this research, which will be a very short section. Now, part of the reason that I spent so much time in this talk talking about this larger initiative that we've been running is that it is possible that this continues. So subject to your input, of course, coming out of today's meeting, we're going to have the opportunity to dig deeper. So research how members are recovering from cut budgets, rebuilding their teams, ramping back requisitions, and also on the other side, maintaining efficiencies or building back business trust or optimizing their global efforts. The last breakout session of tomorrow is going to focus on our future research agenda. And in that session, what we're going to want to do is deep discussion on the largest issues that you all are predicting are going to keep you awake at night. Could have to do with this, could not, as we go into 2025. And then that will form the spine of our research agenda going into the year. And it is very possible, I would actually see it as probably likely, that extensions of this work are part of that research agenda for next year. But let's turn to some answers. So let's go to part 2. Ideas and practices that members have been using to find efficiencies, cost savings, and more. So this is a really simple section. I have one slide that frames up the 4 situations or categories that we saw members finding themselves in. Then I'm going to highlight 2 practices from each of those. So we're going to have 8 practices total. So let's jump in. We saw 4 models or situations for pursuing efficiencies that basically served as a framework for the actions members were taking across the last year or so. The first model or situation is one that we called bare bones survival. Now, I know this might sound too familiar to some folks. So this situation was typically sparked by the business taking sweeping executive action to cut various parts of the university recruiting programs or large swaths of the university recruiting programs. Almost every incident that we found where members found themselves in a bare-bones survival situation, the business ran those interventions without much consultation from the university recruiting team. So then what's left of the UR team, the head of UR needs to figure out how to fill some number of requisitions in more of a survival mode. So we thought of this category as doing something with nothing. A second category, second model, second situation is what we ended up thinking of as a step-down reset. So this situation was where member organizations wanted to maintain a competitive program, but they very consciously put forward the mandate that we want this done at a smaller, less ambitious scale. So in this situation, heads of UR were left with typically lower demand or demand concentrated on a few different categories of talent, and then we're left with the task of figuring out how do we do less with less. A third category, this was the most common category, is one that we called competitive contraction. And the basic idea here was for some members, the business came to them and said, we want to be remain as competitive as we possibly can, but we also need you to cut some costs. You have to spend something less. So a lot of members were left with the task of figuring out how do we do basically the same thing with less. There's a final category that we called lean acceleration. So this is the situation that everyone would, of course, love to be in. But most of the time, this was just sparked by the head of UR themselves, noting, you know what, I bet I can find ways that cutting costs or cutting aspects of the program actually allow me to go faster. And we identified something like 8 or so tactics in our research that we believe to fall in this lean acceleration category. Some of them are situation dependent. They're not all going to be implementable by all members. However, there were 8 ideas that we found for how members ended up improving their quality of hire, improving their recruiter experience, et cetera, while still spending less. So in a moment, I'll go through our tactics within each of these. But I'd love to quickly, I'm not going to ask people to raise their hands, but I'd love to just give everyone a second to place yourselves in this framework. So are you finding yourself just trying to survive, a bare-bones survival mode, operating a less ambitious or a slightly scaled back program, trying to do the same but with less spend, or finding yourself in a moment of accelerating, and if you can find cost savings, that's great. So I'll note that the findings from this presentation are organized around these 4 models, and also your booklets that have the top 33 ideas we surfaced from this research, they are also organized into these 4 models. So this can be a little bit of the framework that you use when looking through everything. And the final note I'll make before doing the case studies is that these, I would highly encourage you to look at and study some of the tactics, or just work with us to study some of the tactics that fall outside of your model, the model that you put yourself in as well, just because we've really seen a lot of the findings to be pretty transferable. So let's start with our first section on bare bones survival. So very few members fell into this camp, but it's such a hard category that we looked pretty far and wide to try to find examples of members who had 75% of their budgets cut, 75% of their teams cut, 90% of their budgets cut, 90% of their teams cut, and still needed to hit some volume of requisitions. So we wanted to profile a few ideas within this. We found 4 total that seemed worth profiling. The other 2 are in your booklet as well. But let me highlight 2 here. One is a very simple tactic, it's this one, and then a second is a much more complex tactic that I'll take more time on. But I wanted to start with just a simple one. So this is a financial service, came from a financial services member who runs a mid-sized program, and they got pretty severe budget and team cuts, and in response to that, the head of UR deployed what I saw as one of the cleverest tactics I've seen. I've since heard that a few other members have tried this as well. Basically what they did was create a quote-unquote out-of-scope cost menu that listed out all of the things that they wouldn't be able to spend money on because of the budget cuts. They then did a roadshow and brought this list to the executives that they thought would be most disappointed that those line items weren't still part of the university recruiting work. And then they basically pitched them. I mean, it was like a menu at a restaurant. They put prices next to each thing and, of course, would say, but we can't go to your school this year because of cuts, but if you would like us to go to your school, you can spend X. So this is not going to be possible for every single UR program because for most, these budget cuts have been firm-wide or company-wide. It's not like this was specific to UR. That being said, this was a really clever tactic to just drum up a little bit of extra revenues to go to market with, and we thought it was interesting to profile. But let's do a second tactic that was a little bit more complex. So this is an insurance member who runs a small program. The taxonomy, by the way, that we ran for this was small programs were below 200 hires a year, mid-sized programs were 200 to 500, large programs were 500 plus. So this is a small program, so below 200 hires a year, and an insurance company. So this was our classic bare bones survival situation. Without any consultation from the university recruiting team, this member's organization cut 75% of their team. So they went from 12 people to 3 people. The funny thing, though, I guess not funny, the odd thing about this, though, was that they had like 80% demand from the year before. So basically they were asked to do close to the exact same number of requisitions, but with 75% fewer team members. So what did they do? They did a lot of things, listed out a number of the measures and strategies on the right-hand side here. They eliminated all travel and on-campus engagement, except for a few diversity-focused initiatives like their HBCU recruiting. They required the business to fund any additional school engagement. They reduced program elements. They utilized referrals and virtual engagement platforms to meet requisition needs, et cetera. But the biggest thing they did, the thing that they said made them able to survive this year, was that they brought in experienced or full-cycle recruiters to help out with some of the requisitions. This required a bit of a frame shift from the university recruiting team, the remaining 3 team members, where they took a step back. They did extremely little recruiting themselves, and instead they thought of themselves as the enablement arm. So they were basically just doing training for the experienced recruiters, training for the business partners that were going out on campus. What were some of the outcomes here? Well, the outcomes weren't great. This was not surprising. This is a bare bones survival strategy for a reason. But there were a few kind of silver linings or positives, one of which was that they were able to hit their requisitions. A big part of this is another concept we'll come back to in our final part. A big part of this was because they had many, many more applications just coming inbound than they knew what to deal with. This is something I know a lot of you are dealing with right now. We think of it as the application avalanche, and they, in some ways, rode this avalanche to be able to hit their requisitions while also spending much less, close to zero, on outbound. Not a long-term strategy, but it helped them survive. Second, they also were able to keep some of the funnel for niche talent or for specialized talent that they were interested in by keeping the business funding some of their diversity programs and some of their talent-specific programs, et cetera. And also, the head of UR was noting this was kind of a nice case study in the fact that we can get by with much, much less. On the flip side, though, morale was very, very low. I mean, she's worried about losing the rest of her team, naturally. And the dynamic of leaning on full-cycle recruiters or experienced recruiters did not work very well. They are not trained for university recruiting. They didn't like the longer cycle of it. So it got them by. Yeah, got them by, but it didn't work very well. So that being said, yeah, I know. The amount of time that I hear about the number of times I've heard about experienced recruiters trying to do university recruiting and having a lot of trouble is high. Yeah. So this was a case of, this was not exactly like, this isn't what we want to happen. It's not a paradigm of success. But we wanted to do one case study of how a member got by in a moment that was more difficult. But let's do a couple cases within our step-down reset category. So say that you're told to scale back the ambition of your programs, the scale of your programs, but your business still wants to run a competitive program, especially with the highest return talent types that you're running. What are some of the ideas that we surfaced from the research? Well, there were a lot more within this category, and I thought we would highlight two, one on programming and then one on limiting the roles that you recruit for. So let's talk about programming for a second. So this was a mid-sized tech company who runs a mid-sized program, so like 200 to 500 people. And they're in the writing on the wall camp. They have gotten 0 mandates to cut anything within the organization as of yet. But they have a new head of HR, they have a new head of TA, they just kind of feel like it's coming. They're asking questions, et cetera. So they decided to get ahead of it, and they decided to start looking for some efficiencies and cost savings. They did make some changes to their recruiting spend, which we can talk about, or which we've outlined one of those tactics in your booklet. But the much larger thing they did was they trimmed aspects of their programming, so of the first 2 years of their entry-level programming. And I want to bring the end up front, the big insight we got from this, which is that they were able to save more by small tweaks to their programming than the sum of their entire outbound university recruiting budget. I'll actually make it concrete for you. They spend about $500,000 a year on recruiting, so everything outbound. They were able to save over $1 million, and we'll talk about that in a moment, solely from doing tweaks to their programming. This is one of the biggest takeaways I had. It's actually the last takeaway we're going to talk about in the final section. The biggest takeaways I had is that the scale of savings that can be found within programming, if we can tap into that, is often far greater, like far, orders of magnitude greater than the scale of savings that could be found through even massive changes to recruiting. But let me do a couple details here. So what were their interventions? The first intervention that they ran was that they standardized new grad raises. So they had a program in the past where they would have new grads at a year get an 8% standardized raise. Everyone else would get a 3% standardized raise. They just changed that. So the new grads now got 3% standardized raises. This decreased spend on new grads, the marginal spend on new grads, by over $1 million. They also reduced the program length, so they made the official programming 1 year instead of 2 years. They increased the training in year 1, but still they made it 1 year instead of 2 years. That reduced the program spend by about 30%. They also just reduced the number of start dates that they had, which saves them another $50,000. Now, this is a step-down reset category for a reason, which is, it's not a lean acceleration category. And the reason is that they think this will make them worse. So this programming feature, they're hiring software engineers competing with a lot of the big tech companies. This 8% raise in year 1, that was a big part of their pitch. So they think this is going to hurt them a lot going into the next couple of years. They think they'll be less competitive. That said, they managed to save more than the total sum of their recruiting spend without cutting a single role or cutting a single school or cutting a single requisition. So let's do one other. So this is a professional services member who runs a very large program, and they received a mandate from the business to cut substantially. And after modeling everything out, they realized they thought they had 3 categorical options for how they could still recruit, but at the lower spend that the business was giving them. Those 3 are on the left. The first was a geographic intervention, so only recruit at a few hubs. The second was basically a spend intervention, so just spend way less per intern that they were hiring. And the third was a role intervention, where they used to recruit, in this case, let's just call it, for the sake of argument, front office and back office, and they were going to limit who the university recruiting team would spend money on and recruit to exclusively front office. So this member decided to do the third of these, basically provide a strategy of giving front office roles, so their most competitive roles, an A-plus experience, and spend much, much more on those roles, and then do a little bit of back office support, but largely take that off the university recruiting team's plate entirely. So in doing this, they were able to save about 45% on their recruiting budgets while maintaining high quality engagement with that top category of talent. I want to flag for a second that I found this category of tactic, and I saw a number of members deploy this category of tactic. I found this fascinating. This was a way to, especially for folks who have like one talent type that matters the most in their organizations. Think like software engineers in tech, or analysts at consulting firms, or the investment banking roles at some of the banks. Often that's 80% of 70% of what the business cares about. In those instances, spend is not always disproportionately on those roles. So a number of members actually found the cost savings they were trying to find without cutting back on their strategy at all on those highest return roles by solely focusing on those roles and basically saying, we're just not going to help out with the rest. It's not an option for everyone, but still, it worked for a number of members. So let's do our third category, competitive contraction. So say that your organization asks you or says, we want to stay as competitive as we possibly can. University recruiting matters massively to the business. However, we want you to cut some percentage of your spend. What were some ideas that we found within this? Well, this was the largest category that members found themselves in. I think we have like a dozen or so tactics that we've profiled in the booklet for you. I thought I would do two. So the first one might be my favorite tactic that we surfaced in all this research. I know I'm not supposed to have favorites on practices, but still, I just thought this one was a really, really elegant solution to a really tricky problem. So the head of UR, from one professional services firm that runs a very large program, noted that they had gotten mandates from the business to cut, but the interesting thing was that the business had flagged for them that they wanted the cuts to be exclusively to schools. So they had like a category that they had been told they needed to cut. Now, this member recruits at a lot of schools, but also they've been spending years building up relationships and brand with the schools that they recruit at. So they were left with a tricky situation, which was how can we, actually find the savings that the business wants us to find while preserving our brand at these schools. And what they did was create what we ended up kind of affectionately calling a campus bridge strategy, where the idea was that they allocated a number of schools to a enhanced virtual type category in which no recruiters travel to that school. So there's zero spend from the recruiting department to go to those schools. However, they identify local business partners, so exclusively people who would not have to spend anything to travel there, so zero T&E, local business partners who could go to the school, and then the recruiters provide back-end support. So they help with some logistics, they help with some of the content and collateral, et cetera. So the idea here was the business partners were able to keep the brand at least alive for the couple years until this member expects that spend is going to come back and they're going to be able to deeply engage those schools again. So just to give you a sense of some of the details, general numbers are in the bottom left there. They went from reduced in-person schools by 20 or so percent, from about 151 to 113. Enhanced virtual went up from 15 to 50. Virtual went down from 91 to 81. 13 schools were knocked off the list entirely. This resulted in about 25% to 30% decrease in the volume of recruiters that the member needed. They were able to hit this through get to these volumes solely through natural attrition and just not backfilling, and they reduced their spend by about 25%. So let's do another category, or another practice, this one dealing with team org efficiencies. This is I will note from the start that I'll come back to this at the end of this practice. This is a really big category that we've been seeing across the board. So this is a financial services member who runs a large program as well. And they found some decent savings for their programs by basically blurring the lines between different recruiting roles and specialties. So there were two largest focuses for them, though there were a few more beyond this. One was coordinators, and two was diversity recruiters. So in both of these instances, they reduced coordinator roles by about 50%, reduced diversity recruiting roles by about 30%. Most of these folks went over to full cycle recruiting roles, so full university recruiting roles. However, what I want to note within this is that this trend was one we spotted across a lot of organizations in the last 6 months. Over the last 10 years, 15 years, there's been kind of a mass explosion in terms of specialization within university recruiters, like recruiters especially. You have finders, you have closers, you have sourcers, you have people who are dealing exclusively with the tech, you have conference recruiters, you have diversity recruiters. You could go on and on. There are a lot of different forms and varieties. We are not seeing that go away entirely, but we are seeing that narrow and coalesce. So people are moving more towards an all-talent recruiter model, where you might have one recruiter at a school instead of 5 or 6 recruiters at a school dealing with different specialties. Most of the time, we've heard a couple members who say that this hurt them a little bit. Most of the time, members are reporting pretty strong results from this initiative. So final category, lean acceleration. So I will note that how this category came up was actually kind of funny. We had a few members who told us, okay, when we were interviewing them, they said, okay, we had pretty substantial cuts to our programs. Then we asked the requisite follow-up question, which is, what were the consequences of those cuts? And they said, actually, things got a lot better. And we were able to achieve better results on key metrics. So that was surprising enough to us that we thought this deserved its own section. And there were about 8 or so ideas that fell into this category. I thought I would highlight 2. One is a precision sourcing strategy. So this is another of my favorites because of how elegantly this solved the larger issue that we are going to talk about a little bit later, the application avalanche. So this is a tech member who runs a mid-sized program, and they found pretty substantial efficiencies and savings by basically trying to reduce the number of applications that they were getting in. So just to set the scene, last year, for a couple hundred roles, they had 20,000 applications that came in. This was just unsustainable. The recruiters had to deal with these manually. People were working overtime. They ended up not being able to review every application because people just manually could not go through that number. I know a lot of folks are dealing with very similar situations. So what did they do? Well, the head of UR here basically deployed a cocktail of tactics to try to get that number down while also increasing the density of people who would be applicable for this job. So basically, they were trying to find screens that would really work. They did 4 main ones. The first was that they applied strict graduation day criteria, just so that they weren't reviewing sophomores for junior roles. Second was that they put the degree requirements in the job headline, just to reduce number of people who were randomly going through and clicking on jobs. So basically, make it exclusively the people who were going to be eligible. They also did a really, really rigorous targeted school analysis to make sure that the only outbound schools they were going to were the ones they were getting high volumes of applicable candidates from. Finally, they removed all LinkedIn postings, all job site postings, so that no one could come to them inbound. Overall, this reduced the application numbers by 75%. They got 5,000 applications instead of 20,000, and pretty much every single result improved. They were able to achieve 15% savings on non-personnel expenses. They filled all requisitions with lower app numbers, improved metrics like NPS and quality of hire, and also there was 0 impact on their DEI efforts. Once again, as I noted, this just felt like a really elegant solution. It requires it to be true that you have too many applications to deal with, which is a blessing and a curse for those who have that, but still an elegant solution. Final one. I couldn't finish this section without doing a case on school contraction as well. So this is a financial services member who runs a large program, and without any mandates from the business, they just decided that they should do a large school reduction process. And they went from 200 schools last year to 70 schools that they're recruiting at this year. They think they're going to be able to reduce that number even more this year, and they have no reduction to requisitions, no reduction to demand, and they noted for us that pretty much all outcomes improved. So what happened here? Well, they ran one of the most rigorous school evaluation processes we've seen. You see the criteria there on the left, and some of the results almost all of the results were positive. We've listed out a little bit of how the team structure changed on the right-hand side here. They have 5 teams on this university recruiting team. The first, strategy and events, they have 11 team members on that team. No one left. They had no reduction in that team. That's because they wanted to go as deep within those 70 schools as they possibly could. Their operations team merged with their recruiting team. They didn't feel like they needed that. Their early ID team went down to 1 person, but they hired about 30 on-campus ambassadors to help with that. Finally, their 2 recruiting teams, one for tech, one for analysts, reduced by about 25 to 30%. So I just want to flag a broader takeaway here that I'll return to in just a moment as well, which is that school contractions were by a decent margin the largest intervention that we found in all of this research. There was only one member that I talked to who didn't have school contractions, reducing the number of schools that they went to as a top priority or as at least something they were considering. And that was a member who runs an entirely virtual process, so they were kind of just in a different category. So let's wrap up on this section. So we had 4 models for pursuing efficiencies, and we listed out 2 practices under each of these here, but you have the other 29, the other 29 practices along with these 4 in your booklets as well. Now this is a very short section. I have one slide on each of the top 5 conclusions that we drew from this research, and I've tried to flag the content for these as we go through. But let me just note what were the largest insights that we took away while we were going through this. The first of them is what we probably thought of as the most surprising insight, which was that this application avalanche that a lot of us are experiencing, in some cases, can provide a bit of a subtle life raft in a moment of spending a lot less on recruiting. So let me explain what I mean by that. A lot of you have flagged for us that you have massively larger volumes of applications coming in for every role than you've ever had at any time in the past. And that doesn't necessarily mean that they're all applicable. Actually, in a lot of cases, they aren't. There are dozens of reasons for this, that this has happened. We have a full study on this if you're interested. But you can kind of think of it as 2 main categories of drivers. One is that the last decade and a half has been defined by removal of barriers to application from university recruiting programs. We've gotten rid of GPA, we've gotten rid of schools in a lot of cases, we've gotten rid of degree requirements, and also we've made it easier to apply. Click to apply, not having to write essays, whatever it is. Second is that AI tools can now enable candidates to auto-apply to as many jobs as they want that meet certain criteria. That doesn't affect all members, but that can really spike applications for some members. Most view this application avalanche as a negative, and in a lot of cases it is. It can overburden recruiters, and most members don't have auto-rank or auto-score on right now, so there's no systematic way to get through this. I will note, as a side note, that those who do have auto-rank or auto-score on and have gotten approval for that have found it just to be a knife through butter when it comes to application avalanches. However, in this moment, when people are being asked to cut so much, some members have realized they actually don't need to do much outbound because they're going to get so much inbound as well. So the first insight that we had is that some members seem to be riding this application avalanche to basically bridge to a year where they can spend more. So saving a lot on outbound. Second takeaway is that getting in the room is paramount. Now, this is a really simple takeaway, but it was still really profound that outcomes for heads of UR and for programs seem to get a lot better when the head of UR was an active participant in the conversation about efficiencies or cost cuttings, and the inverse was true as well. Outcomes seem to be much worse and much less strategic when the head of UR wasn't involved in those conversations. Now, I know this is an obvious conclusion, but let me give you the subtler insight that we drew out of this, which is that sometimes mandates just happen. Like, we can't always know that they're coming. We can't always be in the room. That does just happen. But when we looked at those who weren't in the room and those who were, we did see a slight correlation, which was that those who were disproportionately in the room approached conversations about contractions with business goals in mind, as opposed to team protection goals. This is a subtle shift because I didn't talk to a single head of UR who didn't have some priority towards, or wasn't putting some priority towards preserving the team that they had, building the team that they had. But the finding was still very clear that those who were in the room were disproportionately willing to engage in and put on the table harder cuts that involved team members and involved programs they'd been building. Paradoxically, it seemed like that built trust with heads of TA and heads of HR to bring them into the room. And then consequentially, of course, that provided influence to actually be able to save teams, preserve roles later. Third takeaway, zero-based strategy. Very simple one. In accounting, there's a difference between incremental budgeting and zero-based budgeting. Very simple. Incremental, you just build from what you had the previous year, subtract or add. In zero-based, you build up from the ground every year. This year, we are seeing many more heads of UR shift over to a zero-based approach to budgeting and strategy. So instead of taking the school list that you had last year, the budget that you had last year, and then adding or subtracting, folks are starting from 0 and then adding each school back one at a time, adding each line item back one at a time. What people have noted for us is that this has actually produced cost savings that they would have never expected to find, that have had no impact, no negative impact on their efforts. I flagged this takeaway a minute ago. School contractions were the #1 source of savings that members found. I didn't talk to a single member who thought that they were engaging too few schools. Nearly every single member I talked to thought they were engaging too many. Almost every single one also took action on that and was consciously reducing the number of schools they had. If you're interested in running a session on school contractions, that's something 100% we could do with, you could do with your strategy lead and with some of our data. Finally, programs. Programs were the cost beneath the surface. This might have been the largest or most surprising insight that I found. Programming spend doesn't always fall under the head of UR, but it is absolutely a part of the early careers apparatus. So we've seen some heads of UR argue that it should be included in the broader equation when thinking about efficiencies. And if that can happen, then we've seen members be able to save much more off of relatively inconsequential tweaks to programming than or it would take them much larger changes to their UR recruiting efforts to hit that level of change. So programs might be a large category to try to add into the equation if we're dealing with some mandates. So these were our 5 takeaways. The application avalanche could be a subtle life raft, getting in the room, zero-based strategy, then programs. Now, let me do one final note on some of the work ahead before we wrap up. Now, it's possible that this focus this year on cost cutting, on efficiencies, is just the temporary blip, as I was noting. It's possible that we find ourselves 6 months from now back to much more of an expansion mindset when it comes to university recruiting. If that's true, then we'll pivot all of our work accordingly and study whatever it is that you all are working on. But if we say for a second that it actually might be true that this moment, this movement for efficiencies and cost savings is actually indicative of a broader shift in the market from an era more focused on returns to an era more focused on promise to an era more focused on returns, then that probably defines the work ahead. So what does that mean for the work ahead? I think likely what that would mean for the task ahead is that leaders are tasked with molding their operations into more return-focused machines, focusing on scientific management of progress, building lean, non-redundant teams, running ROI-driven sourcing selections for schools, tools, and conferences, and then, of course, running functional, efficient programs as well. If this year's focus was cost-cutting, next year's focus might be building more efficient, steady-state machines. And as for us, I mean, you all know this, but our purpose in all of this work is to serve you. And that means studying the issues that are most consequential for you. So over the course of today and tomorrow, you're going to have a lot of opportunities to discuss these issues with other members, and we're going to be talking about these issues a lot. The session right after this one is going to give you an opportunity to talk through some of the findings from here. But there is one crucial session that I wanted to draw your attention back to tomorrow, which is the last breakout group that you all have been placed in. That's going to be a future-focused conversation. So in it, we are going to run conversation on the largest issues that you all are working on so that we can have a sense of what we should study next year. So that is a session that I hope over the next 24 hours, I would encourage you to think about what would unlock the most progress for you, what would serve you in your most fundamental challenges, and then please share them tomorrow. Please share them with me. Please share them with your strategy lead so that across the next year we can continue getting to work doing basically the one thing that we are here to do, which is to serve you all in your hardest work. Thank you.